Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, me and these wonderful authors. Thank you to the Open Book Festival and to the African Literary Cities Project for making this conversation possible. I'll start by introducing the authors, and then we'll have some readings and an informal conversation around desiring urbanity in African literatures. How are you guys? I hope you're good. I'll start by introducing Nana. Nana Darkoa is the author of The Sex Lives of African Women, which publishes weekly, described as an astonishing report on the quest for sexual liberation in their starred review. It was also listed by The Economist as the best book of the year. She's the co-founder of Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women, a website, podcast, and festival that publishes and creates content that tells stories of African women's experience around sex, sexualities, and pleasure. Welcome, Nana. Thank you. And then we have Wisani. Hi, Chom.
Hello.
Wisani is a writer and researcher. He holds an MA in creative writing with distinction from the University of Cape Town and is currently completing a PhD in English studies in the same university. A Soft Landing is his first novel. Hi, Wisani. And then we have my good friend Farai. Farai is a Zimbabwean writer whose fiction is influenced by music, our interior selves and alternative realities. He has previously published a short fiction, Green Shadows in the Kiakia Republic, and short stories in Viva Press anthologies, Kwani, Writivism, Story Moja, and Short Story Africa Day. His profiles, literature and reviews, and political essays have appeared in New Frame, Chimurenga Chronic, The Africa Report, New Humanitarian, TRT News, You Are Busy, Contemporary, News Contemporary, and Mail and Guardian. Hi, Farai.
Hello.
Thank you guys so much. I think just, to spark things up, I want you to please read your favorite section from the book. It can or cannot speak to the theme at hand. We'll see how we push it there. And we'll start with Nana.
Thank you so much. So I selected something that I hope fits with the theme.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say it's my favorite part because it's hard to pick a favorite part. But just to give you some context, for people who may not have read my book yet, it's a nonfiction book based on conversations I had with women from different parts of Africa and the diaspora about the experiences of sex, sexualities, and pleasure. So I'm going to be reading from Waris's story. Waris was born in Somalia, but as a child lived in between Somalia, Saudi Arabia, and Italy. So this is her story. Each lover I have had has taken me to the next level sexually, and Kamau was the ultimate. We initially met in November 2018. We connected via Tinder while I was on a work trip to Kenya. And when we met, I told him the stereotypical things women tell men on dates. I was looking for a serious relationship, a commitment, one that could lead to marriage and more children. He told me he wasn't looking for that. What he wanted was a real human connection. I thought that was a weird thing to say to someone on a first date. We agreed that we wanted different things, and so would explore a friendship instead. In February 2019, I was back in Kenya for work and met up with Kamau again. In the interim, I had undergone MDMA therapy, and part of what I had learned was that it is important to let people know exactly who you are. And so I decided to tell Kamau about the experience I'd had. When I told him, he cheesed so hard. He told me that he had been using psychedelic drugs for the past 4 years, and that is why he had been so honest with me when we had originally met. He uses drugs in ceremonial and group sessions. It's how he knew that he didn't want children. Kamau changed my whole outlook on life and sex. I never thought being with a man would help me heal from the wounds of my previous relationships with other men, but that's exactly what he did for me. He taught me about the importance of creating a sensual environment, how to set up the room, the importance of lightning, food, and mood. Every time I had sex with him was the best sex I ever had. He was the first person I had tantric sex with. One time we had sex and it stimulated my vagus nerve. I could feel the orgasm in my spine. Kamau had been on a healing journey of his own. We would often meditate together before having sex. Then we would smoke a joint. With him, I learned how to enjoy weed without fear, and now I associate weed with sexual pleasure. We refer to each other as lovers. When we decided to end our physical relationship, we meditated together and gave each other gifts to mark the end of that relationship. We are still very good friends today.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Nana. I think you've already started, we're going to speak a lot about intimacy and in urban spaces, and I think you've, eased us into that. Wisani?
Of course. I think mine is going to be a little bit shorter. I have two actually, so. Okay, I'm just going to go with this one. Okay, so just a little bit of context. So I'm going to read from a part where. So in the novel we have Anzani, who's the main character, and we have Yolula, who is Anzani's lover, and Yolula is he's doing his PhD and he's just finished his class, and he hasn't seen Anzani in some time, and so I'm going to read from the part where he actually thinks about him and misses him. And as Yolula unplugged the HDMI cable from his laptop, he wondered what Anzani was doing, definitely at work. He was devoted to his work. But who did he complain to now about his annoying boss or his loud colleagues or his cupboard that only opened when it felt like it? Who did he alert about every small thing he did? Even going to the bathroom. He missed all of this. When he'd be teaching a class and his phone would glimmer as each text came, he would not check his phone until his class was over so he could play catch-up and laugh at all the dramatic threads of chaos Anzani had said happened at his office. Yolula switched off the projector, which had now turned blue, and packed his laptop in his bag. The hallway was almost empty. The fire alarm had stopped ringing, and just before he reached the exit of the building, he felt keys in his pocket and remembered he hadn't returned the keys to one of the consultation rooms. He turned, crossed a dark passageway, brown in color and intimidating in its blandness. On his right, the English department's academic staff offices. The wooden floor squeaked until he emerged in the passageway of the second exit. He pushed open the swing door with his arm and reached the consultation rooms. He unlocked the room he had the key to and locked it behind him. Settling on a chair, he took out his laptop and opened the Word document in which he had been typing notes for his dissertation chapter before he went into his seminar. He read it out loud now. The conceptualization of city spaces as liberating, a myth for Black South African queer subjects. Then he stared at the screen a long bit. He had come to accept that he wasn't going to finish his doctorate in the stipulated 3-year period. His writing had suffered a setback because he had taken a few more first-year classes to tutor in order to be able to pay the year's fees. The thing he regretted the most was that he had used his first year to work on what his supervisor had called an inconclusive research proposal, something he could have done during his gap year. He placed his hands on the keyboard, closed his eyes, and willed his mind to start working. Words did not float in his head. And all he could see in his mind was Anzani's face. He took out his cell phone and opened his contact list, typing Z. Zenani's name popped up, and then he remembered the last time he'd called her, a few weeks after Anzani's return to the city, when he'd gone on Facebook and searched her profile for a number. He'd asked to call, and she had agreed. When she'd answered the phone, he had inquired about Anzani, and she had humored him. She had given him an update. He was doing well, but said she was not the right person to answer all the questions he had. She had told him she would pass on his message and that she was certain Anzani would get in touch with him in due course. Then she said she was late for a meeting before she hung up. Yolula put his phone away and started typing furiously.
Really? Thank you so much. I'm so glad you actually read from Yolula's part because I want to speak about polyvocality, right, and what's happening with you, sort of like how you guys shift narrative voices. So I'm glad you read that part, and I want to also speak about Anzani, who's also very frustrating. Farai, please read for us.
Okay, I'm going to stick to the theme of underpants and removals. So, let me just... Right, so there are three protagonists in this book. There's a brother and sister, sibling pair, Jedza and Natsai, and then the third protagonist is the avenues, the place that they go to live. So Jedza has arrived in the avenues. This is bang in the middle of the book. He's been running away from his financial and spiritual problems, and then he gets to the avenues and discovers his problems are more than financial and spiritual. Today is either day 7 or day 8 since I took the coffee, says Jedza narrating. Everlast swears by his coffee, and I have no reason to doubt him. He has a daily stream of cars lining up to buy from him. It took me a while to realize that the guys standing at the avenue's corners with ironing boards were selling sex enhancement stuff. Last, as the other Rastas call him, laughs when I ask him how long he has been running this game. Ah, Mkom, did you really think people could iron this much? I initially thought that Last was a bit of a charlatan, that he was just a salesman punting his product, so that, of course, he would say anything to push a sale. He proved me wrong. I am pleased. Loveness was pleased, briefly. The flat I moved into, owned by Loveness, is in the same complex and 1 floor above hers. She does not really expect me to pay rent, but I do anyway, when I can. To make up for the rent shortfall, I bypassed her electrical meter so that she has free electricity whenever there is power. Last and his gear became necessary when this matchstick failed to light up with her. This had never happened to me before and still only happens when I'm with her. Her power to intimidate me has not lessened, and much as I desire her, the stick threatens to burn, then swiftly fizzles out. When I brought the subject up with the corner rastas, I did at first pretend I was asking for someone else. They immediately caught on, and it was only after their laughter at my having been fixed by Loveness that they called Last over to show me his pouch. I started off with the Blue Diamonds, generic and not so legal Viagra. After weeks of Loveness twirling my twig with her fingers for what seemed like hours on end, for which she started calling me Tamba Tamba. It finally burst into flame. The Blue Diamonds cleared my pipes, but constricted my nostrils, and then I breathed like a bull with a cold, and Loveness could not get going with all my wheezing.
Ooh. Ooh.
Fun fact, Mapule, actually, I sent her a very early draft of this chapter. And so she's responsible for a lot of the mischief involved with that chapter.
No, stop selling me out like that. Thank you so much. I think you started with a really great point that I want to speak about, that you have 3 protagonists. And we have so many voices in your book, Nana, as well as you, Wisani. And I think a lot of the times when we think of urbanity, we do get, that multiple voices, a lot of people speaking. And when we think about novels, or even when we think about nonfiction, we think, of that authorial figure or that narratorial voice who's guiding us and sort of like knows everything and, is responsible for our journey in the book. But you guys just throw that out the window. And we have this polyvocality and this multiple voices, and we also see plays of intertextuality. Wisani, with We Need New Names and Generations. We get Marachera, I'm assuming, in the text as a character and so forth. And I'm really interested in that polyvocality and sort of like the dismantling of the authorial figure and how that speaks, to urbanity and multi-voiced narratives. So we can't keep on doing this line thing, so you guys pitch in when you want to say something.
All right.
Oh, wow.
take this one?
Okay. Firstly, yes, I agree. There's a million voices. First person singular plural, second person singular plural.
And I found it fascinating that you do that. That you sort of like use multiple tenses.
Yeah,
And first,
and intimate, and that comes from editing. I want to claim that, but it's not me. I had many different perspectives that were taken by the characters and all of that, but I did not know how to put it in one cohesive story, in one cohesive narrative. And I was fortunate enough to have an editor who understood that. And that's why you've got almost this, weaving in and out and going close, far, plural, singular, just to bring it all together. But yeah, there's a lot of that. So you have these wee choruses, you have a very intimate feeling, your skin, temperatures, tastes, mouth, and then you go out. Yeah, that's all editing.
Yeah, it's fascinating because you're right. It taps into the multisensorial. It's sort of like sensorial as well. And Nana, we only hear your story at the end, and with 6 years of interviewing these women, how was the experience of speaking to them, and how was it? So how do you capture these voices and these stories in such? Because like you are not silenced yourself as an author. You're sort of like accompanying them in ways that are very interesting, and I'm very interested in the journey, with that.
Yes, no. For me, it's interesting to reflect multiple voices, multiple perspectives. My process was very much speaking to people individually, and everybody's story is written in the first person. So part of what was really fun for me was almost getting the chance to embody somebody else, right, and to speak in their voice. So when you read the book, you realize that each chapter has a different voice, each chapter has a different tone, a different rhythm. We use language from whichever community that person came from, if that's the language they use. And for me, it's interesting because you get, I guess, a richness in the stories and multiple perspectives. So you're not necessarily going to have people who are agreeing with each other, right? Different points of views come across, which for me is like the really interesting thing with nonfiction. And as an author, in a sense, I stay back. I'm not necessarily sharing my thoughts on whatever a person's experiences are, but then what I do is also share my story. So my voice just becomes one of many in the book.
That is so fascinating. And Wisani, I'm so glad you read actually Yolula's part, all right? Because I think he's the only person in the book who actually has, who sort of shares the narrative space with Anzani. Yes. And I thought that was so interesting because he sort of is in love with Anzani, and I'd like to think Anzani is in love with him too, although Anzani is such a complicated character. And I was like, why give Yolula that space? And I enjoyed that you did, right? Because he gets to sort of sit with Anzani's grief in ways that we start to see Anzani also as an unfair character, in a lot of ways.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thinking, going back to the narrative voice question, I think what I have in the novel is more of a shifting narrative perspective, right, more than a narrative voice. And I think I do that because Yolula and Anzani hold contrasting views when it comes to the spaces that they occupy, right? Yolula is more aware of how politicized the space is, especially the urban space, whereas Anzani is kind of nonchalant, right? He's not really into the politics of space. And so for me, I shifted the narrative between these two narrative perspective between these two characters because I was really trying to understand, or rather think through how these characters how they are made and remade by the spaces that they occupy, but also how they negotiate access to the spaces, especially in contrasting way.
I love that because Yolula's so much more comfortable with Cape Town, right? And I think if we just relied solely on Anzani, we would have sort of an alienated experience of the city.
Of course.
I really like that. I want to speak about electricity and power and the urban. I don't want to speak about South Africa's electricity and power, but we can go there. But I'm really interested, especially Wisani and Avenues by Train are very invested in electricity, right? Part of the story, part of Wisani's story is set in Mbambanglisi, which is an Mbambanglisi,
Yes.
which is an informal settlement, I think, in Tanin.
Yes.
And one of Farai's protagonists is an electrician, but there's also a lot of like other electricities at work, right? With the steam train and many others. So I want to speak about how these texts think with electricity and power, but also not just solely sort of like the literal uses of electricity in an urban space, right? But how there's a lot of on and offing, right, of people, of connections, and this happens also in your text, Nana, and in this on and offing, people are charged, right, and are also charging others in ways that describe, and also the urban space and how people connect. Yeah.
Should I go?
Wisani.
Yeah, of course. I'll take this one. I think that is quite a nice reading of the work, but I don't think that is what I had when I was writing the electricity parts. I was quite. I think I was thinking about the I guess inequality in terms of access to resources,
Yeah.
right? If Anzani and Newo had like proper electricity, maybe Newo wouldn't have, maybe Newo would still be alive,
alive,
right?
yeah.
Maybe Anzani's trajectory would have been different, right?
Yeah. And
so
also they meet, they actually have their first interaction with go fix the
power. So that's what I had. I think I was mad at this whole facade of the rainbow nation that we have. We like to declare in the sky that we are a rainbow nation, but what's happening in the ground, like what work is taking place, right? A rainbow nation means that we are an equal society, and I don't think we are. And I think that is what I was thinking as I was writing the electricity and power skills.
Yeah, you were sort of connecting it to sort of like class and
Yes,
so
yes.
what it means to live in an informal settlement,
Of course.
and to have to be in charge of having to get yourself your own electricity
Yeah.
illegally.
Yeah.
Nana or
I mean, with me, obviously, I'm dealing more with electricity in the, I guess, metaphorical sense.
in the
In terms of the chemistry that people feel.
Yeah.
But thinking about things being switched on and off, I'm thinking of one of the women I interviewed for my book, who I called Nafi, who was in a long-distance relationship
Yeah.
with someone, and how they really kept in touch
Yeah.
was through sexting.
Yeah.
And then there are times when, you may be sexting somebody and they ghost you, which I guess is like when the power goes off.
we've all been through that. Okay, I have.
Yeah, so that's the only connection
Yeah.
I can think to this.
Nafi's story, I confuse Naru and Nafi, but Nafi's story, I find it so complex also that when they have a lot of virtual sex, and
Yes.
it goes on for years. And like when they meet and have babies and now have this happy family, it's no longer the same. And it seems like, and I want to speak about the cyberspace. It seems like the cyberspace, allows this relationship, and actual physical intimacy becomes very difficult to maintain. Farai, Jedza is an electrician. Jedza also is spiritually, maybe you can connect the electricity to his ancestral journey and stuff. I don't know.
Jedza's a dodgy electrician. My use of electricity is very literal.
Yeah.
So water is like a running theme.
Yeah.
Not even like, it is a running theme all the way from the beginning.
Yeah.
And one of the things very early on in the novel, it talks about how water is harnessed in Zimbabwe. That big monstrosity, Lake Kariba. And they dammed a whole valley for like 30, 60 kilometers just to create electricity. So from that's where the electricity element spun off. So there's land, there's water, and there's electricity. And when I was thinking of Jedza's profession, I mean, what comes instinctively to a writer writing a book is to make your protagonist a writer. So I tried to steer away from that. And the electricity was already there. I was already tapping into that. And there's also an element where there's a shortage of electricity. And there's something that happens in states, which, you know, Zimbabweans love talking about how it's now happening in South Africa. And having these cautionary tales where when the state starts failing, necessities become luxuries.
Yeah.
And whoever can arrange those necessities becomes the plug, your guy. In your phone, you'll have Jimmy electricity, you'll have Terence water, you'll have Mapule sugar. And so Jedza becomes that guy. And that electricity is also an indication of, you know, the state of the economy, that you've got this guy who is an unqualified electrician, but he's providing a national resource.
Yeah, and is valued for that. I think when he does get to Harare, his skills allow him to move in ways that would have probably been different if he... Okay, I want to now speak about urbanity and memory. In all these texts, people move around, but they are haunted in a lot of ways by memories. We see in Anzani's life in Cape Town. I can't say if it's just me, but I find Anzani to be a bit frustrating. But then I was just like, I've been through grief, and I like grief can do that, you know. But this haunt, right? And with Neo and remembering Neo. And with Avenues by Train, I think the title speaks for itself. There's a lot of movement, you know, from, you know, the train. The book starts with a train accident, but the protagonist moves from Milner's Drift to Chega Ose to the Avenues and then back home. And there's also a lot of movement in your text, and I'm just like, people travel so much when I'm reading the lives of the sex lives of African women, and I think also being able to move has also empowered women to have sex in ways that I think would have been impossible if we weren't, you know, moving in the ways that we are moving now. But we see women moving to marry, to fuck, to learn in your text, and to heal, to forget, and to remember. And in all these texts, you know, people move, however, some things stay the same. And you see this when Anzani goes back to Zanin, and not much has changed. And the same with Jedza when he sees his parents. I find that image, you know, with these parents, like, they'll never change when he goes back to Milner's Drift. But so how does memory work, you know, when we speak about, you know, there's no, I don't want to say rural, but I want to complicate notions of rural and sort of like say rural being the past, or, you know, or rural being a backwardness, but that's not, I don't want to open up, but how do spaces, you know, reinvent people, but also how do memories also, you know, complicate that reinvention, right? And are people really reinvented as long as they remember, right? And how,
I really like this question around how spaces allow people to reinvent, because for a lot of the women that I interviewed, moving into a new space allowed them an opportunity to discover themselves, right? In a new city, in a new country where you may not have your family.
A new site, a new blog.
You may not feel so judged, you know? So like you mentioned, there are people in my book who moved for relationships. There's one character, Noura, who met someone on Massmatch, a Muslim dating app, married him online, and then he came to Kenya so they could consummate their marriage.
You know?
And then she later moved to Senegal to be like his third wife. So I think people, especially in my book, use space as a way to experiment, to discover, and I feel like, that's quite important when it comes to sex and sexuality, but then also talking about people being haunted by the maybe spaces where they come from originally. You also had stories of people who were, for instance, second-generation migrants, you know, being raised somewhere like Canada, but very much raised with the values of their home country. In Yami's case, it was Malawi. So it's almost like you're in a different space, but the way you've been raised is very much due to your parents' country of origin, but also that parent is stuck in a particular era, right? Their country may no longer be in that space, but they're still trying to raise you with the values from like the 60s,
like
for
stagnant
instance.
diaspora. So we always think of diaspora as this, always shifting newness and all these
Exactly.
things, but we never think of diaspora sort of like stagnant in that way when we think of generations in diasporic context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Cool. I guess in my work, we have Anzani, who comes from Mbamamejisi, and he leaves Mbamamejisi for Cape Town because he wants respite from, I guess, his past traumas, right? And so he leaves Mbamamejisi because it triggers memories of trauma. The space itself triggers memories of trauma. And then he gets to Cape Town, and the same thing still happens, right? And I think for him, he forgets that the body itself carries the trauma, right? The psyche carries the trauma, and the memories will always be there to kind of remind him that you kind of need to engage this past that you're running away from, right? And so I think in that way he's meshing the urban and the rural. He's carrying the rural with him to the urban, and also both spaces don't offer him refuge, right? He's kind of forced to kind of deal with this trauma.
Yeah, I like sort of like even how these texts work with and thinking of rural in its more complicated terms, as they was more codependent, like even past and present is codependent and not really separate. So Farai, please also speak on you have there's a lot of ancestral memory that's also happening in the text.
I think I was listening to Wisani speak just now. There's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of similarities in our conceptions of space. So the element I was exploring was how you can, and this is what happens to the protagonists, and even the secondary characters. You can leave a place and go somewhere else, but you take yourself with you. And place in itself exists in someone's mind. You have if you live in a place in a certain period of your life and you leave, you retain, that place is retained as a memory in you. You go back to that same place 20 years later, the place may or may not still be the same, but it's to you internally it's a different place. You're seeing it through different eyes. It's not what it was. You don't have the sensations, the emotions that you had of that place at a certain time. And that previous place that's in your mind, it's like a time capsule in so many ways, including language. I experience it when people, outside of the novel, you have, because the last 20 years created a huge migration out of Zimbabwe. And I was siblings who left the country 20 years ago. They come back and they're speaking Shona that's like from a time capsule 20 years ago. What they understand about the country is they're like, oh, how does this work? Can you get this again? Because they're in that place, but they're not seeing that place, so to speak. So there's a lot of that going on in the novel. And then ancestrally, that's big. That's the place, very briefly, the place on which Harare was built, this is all in the novel, by the way, there's a concept of history starts with, Sir so-and-so mapped out this farm, or the pioneers or founders raised the Union Jack in this place, etc. That's not when history starts. And that's what the novel explores, that history is interrupted from that place. That's not when history starts.
Yeah, I really enjoyed sort of like the eventfulness of cultural pasts and sort of like an ancestry, sort of like these dual worlds that are living and existing together. And one can be accessed through portals. There's a lot of mermaid references and the Njuva, and who can we access through bodies of water, but also through trees, right? So and we know in Harare there's sort of you speak a lot about sort of like the urban planning, you know how the jacarandas are lined and how the masasa trees are lined, and in the avenues this is sort of like seen as a decorative, like to me, how do we make the city more pretty and so forth. But then it becomes an ancestral portal for Natsai and for Jeta, and I really loved how you sort of, you know, a cultural past, but also a cultural past that has now turned into a decorative, and how those two things are existing together. I don't know if any of you want to read more from the text, or we should move from to our last point and start to open for questions. But I think the audience needs to be tantalized, you know, a bit more with the writing, because we've been chatting for so long, and then we can speak about desire and intimacy. So maybe let's get you now. Baton, who's
I'll look for something. Well, what have you read?
okay, maybe we can have from Wisani and from you,
Okay.
Farai.
I'm trying to find a nicer part that is not traumatic, because I feel like the work's
We love drama. Give us the drama.
Okay, let's read something that is quite nice. So I'm going to read from a part where Yolula and Anzania, they're together at Yolula's place, and
Yeah.
they are, I guess, spending time together after having gone to attend at Yolula's exhibition in town.
Yeah.
So they return to his place, and then, you know, they're just chilling, getting to know each other. Okay, is that back home? Anzani placed his arm along the couch's armrest and stretched his legs before he leaned back. Yes, but at his father's place. Where is he now? My old man. Anzani nodded. Dead. Oh. Yolula came to settle next to him. He pulled the throw from his armrest and covered Anzani up to his waist. Then he pulled a cushion from the corner of the sofa and placed it on top of his thighs before putting a mouse he'd taken out from the TV stand drawer on top. My dad was a coward, Yolula said. I want you to hear this EP. There's this song that reminds me of you whenever it comes on. He moved the mouse on top of the cushion. What do you mean he was a coward? He took his own life. I was still young, so I don't remember much about him. But I have vivid memories of this crawl growing up, because we used to frequent it a lot with my cousins. Do you know what pushed him to do it? Selfishness, Yolula shrugged. Okay, so we had to pay for this EP before it was released. So like pay for the work in advance so she could complete it. People actually came through for her, hey? Who is she? Misaki. Imagine the level of trust and respect people have in your work to pay for it before it has been produced, and she delivered. Anzani started Yolula. You're nonchalant. Yolula threw his head to the side to look at Anzani. Maybe he was going through a lot, Anzani added. You're dead. Maybe life had him by the collar. I'm just thinking. I wouldn't make excuses for that man. It's one of those things you get over. When I asked the relevant questions, I didn't get answers. I guess I let it rest. And your mother? She's here, in Delft, with the children. You have siblings, half siblings, but yes. And you've met them. We didn't grow up together, so our relationship is not that solid. Do you have a relationship with her? We tried establishing one, but you know, once you leave an area for weeds to grow tall, it becomes difficult clearing it out. So we're working on it. Anzani nodded. Okay, one last question. He smiled. Does she mention anything about your dad? Yolula shook his head, then scratched his forehead. The story my grandmother told me doesn't align with what she's told me. Like, she's economical with the truth. She left my dad, and briefly after he died by suicide. I mean, my dad was not an angel. Things I heard about that man would make you cringe. But me, why did she leave me with him? I had a great childhood and all, but it lacked something, her presence, and that is just something she can't make up for now.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to go like a chapter back from the first reading I read. So this is Jedza. He's just moved to the avenues, or he's clinching that deal, and he meets up with old childhood girlfriend in the avenues, and says him narrating. Reaching out, I had spoken to Loveness on the phone a couple times soon after moving here. She was civil but distant, which I understood, given that we had hardly kept in touch after she left Minersdrift years ago, right after school. 2 days ago, on Friday morning, she called in a cheery voice. She asked me how I felt, having grown up in a fairly comfortable town like Minersdrift, and now living in the unclipped toenails of the southern townships. Then she laughed and invited me for drinks in the avenues. Excited and even hopeful, I hired a rickety little Honda Fit from a mechanic a few houses down the street and drove to the Tipperary bar. The inside of the pub now doubles as a nightclub, and so it is dimly lit, loud music blaring from the DJ stage, sweaty, smoke-filled, and packed with the drunken horny. The pickpockets do not give you room to breathe, and when they do, the working women take up the shift. Which is why the long outside bar with its low-hanging thatched roof, in addition to the overgrown garden and aged, peeling facades all around, is better suited for conversation. We sat under the gazebo and talked tentatively about what we had been doing with our lives. She looked like I expected a grown-up loveness to look, certain and assured, wily and direct when directness was required, yet vague when vagueness was called for. Then she looked into my eyes, and in an instant, I was the dumbfounded boy in the classroom sweating, the love letter hidden in my pocket. She was a woman now, and only the beer kept me composed. We drank, and as we drank more, I loosened up and she smiled. Throughout the night, young women dressed in short skirts, tights, and cropped tops would sway in through the gates and whisper in her ear. Some she would dismiss swiftly, and now and again, she would allow one to sit with us for a while. I figured she was running something there on the side, but it was none of my business. I told her about my electrical apprenticeship, that I had abandoned it, and how I now hustled a living fixing illegal electrical connections. I did not need to tell her my reasons for leaving Minersdrift, nor she to tell me hers. It is a known thing that at some point that town squeezes, or the city calls, sometimes both, and then one simply leaves. Either way, she was diplomatic and did not bring that up. You have skills, jedza wemastedza, she said. You haven't done badly given the situation in this country. She went on for a bit as the girls came and went, and I started to feel my alcohol limit approaching. It was important I stay clear-headed enough to pay attention because she had mentioned in our phone conversation that she had a few apartments in her name, including one in the complex where she stayed, that she might let me use for a while. The avenues held such allure for me, I hung on to every word. Our last communication from my sister Natsai had come from the avenues, and I kept wondering if by hanging out there I might find out what had happened to her, and perhaps rekindle something with Loveness too. Loveness did not invite me over to her place that night. The point at which I could have had enough courage to make a move on her passed swiftly, and I was now just keeping it together, trying not to do or say something stupid. The apartment offer stands, jedza wemastedza. Give me a call, she said, as she stood up and then told the barman she would cover whatever I drank after she had left.
Thank you so much. Are you going to read? Yeah. And Nana?
Sure. So because we've mentioned Nafi a number of times in her on-off
Yeah.
relationship, I'll read a section from that. When I was initially shown Hassan's picture, I thought he was cute, but that was it. At the time, I was still dating the same guy I had dated from the age of 16. During the summer of 2007, my cousin came to visit me in South Africa, where I lived at the time. When she went back to Cameroon, she met up with Hassan, who was there on holiday with his girlfriend. She showed him pictures of her time in South Africa and pointed me out to him. This is my cousin, Nafi. 2 months later, I traveled to Brussels to work and messaged my cousin. She told me Hassan was also in Brussels visiting his girlfriend and connected herself, Hassan, and me via a group chat. That night, we all started chatting together. Eventually, my cousin went offline, but Hassan and I continued until late in the night. We didn't meet up physically on that occasion, but stayed in constant touch afterwards. Soon, our conversations became more and more intimate, and we started having phone and video sex, although we were both in relationships with other people. He was the first person that I ever had cyber sex with. This virtual sexual relationship went on for a year. There was even one time when we were both home in Cameroon at the same time, but didn't see each other physically. By then, we had lots of conversations about how physically attracted we were to each other, but he was in a long-term relationship, and I had just ended my own long-term relationship and did not want to start a new one, especially one that would be at a distance. Over time, Hassan became my confidant. I even told him when I met someone new. So we would go from him giving me advice about how to talk to the new guy I had just met to having video sex 15 minutes later.
Well, I want to now open. I want to start to open the conversation and invite questions from the audience. But just one final point, and especially from the parts that you've read, these texts really, if you read them, I loved, and I think this is sort of tied also to polyvocality. Like, there's no right or wrong form of intimacy, all right? And we see sometimes like, that intimacy can also be passionless, and that it can also be dangerous and violent for some people is how they prefer to be intimate. So the tone of intimacy and how it's also tied to space is not, the same tone. Thank you so much for your wonderful readings and for these very beautiful books. I feel very honored to have spoken to you guys. I want to now open for any questions from the audience. Feel free. We have a mic going around, and please, when you ask your question, the sessions are being recorded, so please hold the mic so we can record you.
Hello. Okay. Thank you all for your readings. This question is directed at no one in particular, but what I'd like to ask is, how do you think space and the cities we live in influence our identities and the personal choices we make, and for your characters as well?
Okay, let me see if I can answer it. That's quite an interesting one, because I'm trying to think of my character Yolula, who occupies the city space of Cape Town, but does not really feel welcome. Yolula's dissertation talks about how he compares how black and white individuals occupy the city space of Cape Town specifically, right? And you think through ideas of race and class that kind of determines who gets to occupy the city center, right? And I think those two things kind of determine one's identity. I think recently we saw how masses of black people, when the tech strike happened, had to kind of walk from the city center to the outskirts, right? And I think that speaks to this class issue where you have masses of black individuals coming to the city center in the morning, and then at night they have to kind of leave, right? And so the city center extracts labor from them, right? And then discards them afterwards. And I think that molds your relationship to I guess to the city space. Yeah, that might not be coherent, but yeah.
You have.
Yeah, my response is very similar to his. So I will actually just extend the cities are places of migration. In our context, the initial migration is, in the capitalist era, is with the colonizers setting up the mines and the factories and the commercialized farms and all of that. And then we have, which still exists now, that spatial apartheid, where you've got black people needed to work, but also required to be out of sight after they're done working, which is what Wisani just been talking about. But then there's an even longer term, more distant migration from wherever around the country, and with the Witwatersrand specifically, the Wenela system, where the entire Southern Africa, you've got train lines coming in, which still happens. It's nothing new. It's been happening for 150 years. So cities they're places of migration. All the big cities in this region, anyway, I suppose around the world. And the people the characters here, they are changed by their desire to fit in to whatever vibe is in the city they're in, whatever circumstances they find themselves in. And yet, on a deeper level, they are still essentially the same people they were. It's like their little former selves are stuck in there, and now they've got these outer shells that are just performing assimilation in whatever city they're in.
That's so powerful. Thank you. Any other questions?
Thank you very much. Whew, okay, let me choose this question. Okay. Farai is right?
Farai.
Yes. How do personal narratives in your book speak to the fluidity of space and place in the making of ancestral memory? And perhaps could start off by defining what you refer to as ancestral memory.
Sorry, just refer. You said how does?
So how do personal narratives, right,
Right.
speak to the fluidity of space and place in terms of the construction, or rather the making of ancestral memory that you allude to in your paper?
That is a very deep question. I'm trying to break it down.
I think you can speak about sort of like water, right? And sort of like the njuva and natsai, right? And sort of like how that is some form of ancestral memory, but is fluid across generations.
There is the ancestral memory that, well, the way it's structured in here. So it operates on two levels. There's a national narrative of ancestral memory. People wonder why ZANU-PF has been in power for 40 years. It's not, it's also because they're rigging elections, but they tap into something that the liberation war was not fought just 40, 50 years ago. There was always resistance by our ancestors to colonization, all the way from 1888, 1882. There's a long-running narrative. The most symbolic thing that Nkomo and the initial ZANU, before it became what it is, as ZAPU, tapped into, if you look in the archives, there are these pictures of a ceremonial handover of tools of war in the 1960s, where the nationalists were tapping into that ancestral memory of resisting colonization. And that's what was used to create the nationalist narrative that carried the war through to 1980. That's on the national scale. On the personal scale, there's a parallel narrative, which I think is similar to what you are talking about, where you've got individuals who, as much as they're going through hardships, as much as they're trying to reinvent themselves, like the two siblings, they've got a 10-year gap. The younger one, Jedza, he has an ancestral relationship with his sister. His sister passed away when he's young, but then he's got a recollection of this older sister figure. It's not a maternal figure, it's an older sister figure that was guiding him, and then she suddenly disappeared. And then he goes on this trajectory that is parallel to his own trajectory, where he's trying to define himself, find himself, and he's got this guiding beacon in the form of his sister. And that also exists in like different characters. When you go into on a communal level, that's where the water spirits come in. That's where I'm trying to use the right phrases, the clan names, those clan hierarchies, which are also lineages going back a few hundred years. You tap into the ancestors. There are many ways to conceive them. They can be communal wisdom, they can be a collective consciousness that is passed down the generations. That does not change just because they're now technological tools and capitalism. So that ancestral, your personal narrative, the personal character taps into those ancestral consciousnesses in the performance of ritual. And that's where the water deities come in. That's where you have these long passages where two people meet and they say, oh, who are you? I am so-and-so of so-and-so who is descended from so-and-so, who comes from these people, who come from this area, who come from whatever. It's looking for kinship. It's looking for where are you and how far in your personal development are you in, what makes up your collective consciousness as a people.
Thank you.
I hope I gave a equally obscure response.
We have another question.
Thank you, thank you. I've got a question for Nana. When it came to speaking about sex with women from different cities and countries, where did you find it most difficult to find these stories? And were there any specific spaces where it was more challenging for you to have these conversations?
I know that's a great question. I think what for me was most difficult was accessing people and regions where I didn't really speak the language. I did a lot of call-outs, and obviously my call-outs were in English. So I think, in a sense, you know, a lot of the people I spoke to were from either Anglophone parts of the continent or some Francophones and one person from Lusophone, but most of the Francophones were bilingual. I found it hard to reach people, and especially the northern part of Africa. I interviewed a number of people from Egypt, but somehow, you know, one interview that was set up with someone in Morocco didn't happen. For me, one of the things that was really great was actually interviewing somebody from Sao Tome, which is an island off the coast of West Africa. It's a Portuguese-speaking country. But then I was there on holiday. My tour guide was amazing, and I was like, do you know any Sao Tomean women who would be happy to tell me about the experiences of sex from my book? And he said, yes, my friend, and he was our translator, you know, so I feel like that's something that I am now doing a little more consciously with my second book, actually, just working with interpreters and facilitators so I can reach people who I would normally not have access to.
Oh, yay. Polo.
Thank you, everybody. I think I'm just going to ask a very, very simple question. And maybe that simple question, it comes out of what Farai said earlier about the avenues being a narrative voice. I think you said something about the avenues themselves telling a story. So I was trying to work out to what extent then the cities are characters who do tell stories. And Nana, you may have many, many characters telling very many different stories, but cities as characters and how you attend to those in your writing.
That's a simple, beautiful question.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, cities as characters. I think for me, I was always interested in how people's relationship to sexuality had been shaped by where they had been raised and, you know, the cities or countries where they had been born. And I felt like that very much shaped people's experiences. It was also really interesting to see how people sometimes felt free, especially women, outside their regular spaces, or maybe queer people felt like they had more of a sense of freedom once they had been able to migrate. For me, those were the ways in which, you know, people's sense of place affected who they were in terms of their identity.
Yeah, my concept of the city in the way I put it here was, I think one of the foundational moments of writing about this was I was trying to do nonfiction about how the city changes. And then I fictionalized that. So the avenues themselves actually exist, and a lot of this, I suppose, is historical fiction. You will have the choruses, the voices of the people who actually built the city, but what they intended is not what it is now. So you've got these original architectures, similar to, I'm not sure what the equivalent here is in Cape Town, Killarney, Rosebank, Saxonwold. That's what the avenues looks like. Avenues of trees, jacarandas, tree-lined streets, the literal dictionary definition. And you've got these double-story teak wood flooring mansions set up by the original administrators of the always laughed that Zimbabwe was colonized by a company. The British South Africa company, that's where they lived. Those structures are still there. But what exists now is something completely different. There's a different type of commerce going on. And there's vending, there's sex work, there's hustling, it's a whole different thing. But these things are living there. But what's happening now is not a distinct thing. It's a continuation. It's just what is now there in this long timeline of what happens when you disrupt a place. That's what I was looking into.
Thank you so much. I'm not missing any questions. Okay, we'll take one last question before they kick us out. James?
Hi, everyone. Reflecting on your work, how does desire or representations of desire maybe complicate this sort of urban spatial assemblage that is going on in these works? I mean, reflecting on Wisani's comment about how Cape Town assembles people in a specific way, how does then desire either reinforce perhaps or complicate and disrupt that?
Does that mean me?
Wisani?
How does desire, complicates?
How does desire...
Sorry.
Yeah, one more time, please.
How does desire or representations of desire then complicate the sort of spatial assemblage that is going on in the city, right? So how does the urban, how is the urban impacted by desire?
Yeah. That's quite interesting because I think Cape Town plays into the whole notion that it offers liberation to queer individuals, right? And I guess that speaks to the desire aspect of it, right? Whereas that is not the truth, not entirely. I guess you have to think of whose desire, and I guess it's if you think of that, if you think of whose desire, then you definitely know that. I think what you need to do is just place black individuals within the city space, and then you get to kind of see whose desire is being put at the forefront in this notion that Cape Town is liberating. I don't.
Is it liberating as a queer person?
Hell no. Not really. That's no. It's not. It's a farce. And I think that's what I'm saying. You just if you want to see when they say it's liberating, who they're talking about, just put black people there, and then you'll kind of see who they are speaking about. It is not liberating at all.
Yeah. Guys, thank you so much. I feel like so honored to have read these books. Like I enjoyed all of them, and thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for attending the session. Thank you to the Open Book Festival and the African Literary Cities Project for making this conversation possible. I think we'll call it a day, and bye everyone. Thank you.